Let's go live to Economics editor at The Australian, Adam Creighton. Now, Adam, good to see you once again. The coronavirus is starting to have an economic impact. We see that from a number of studies. The market is really not being affected by it, but retailers such as JB Hi-Fi are reporting a decline and perhaps some problems coming out of factories in China.
Yeah, certainly that's right. Well, they do say that China is the workshop of the world these days. It basically affects every supply chain that exists, and certainly we've seen warnings recently from JB Hi-Fi, also Harvey Norman, that many of the electronic goods won't be delivered in Australia on time. We've also heard from Horizon, the rail freight operator, that 66 carriages which are manufactured in China will be seriously delayed. Blackmores, the vitamin company, is currently in a trading hold. It sells a lot of vitamins and supplements in China, and it's not just the supply chains, but it's also on the retail front at home. Of course, Australia has very large Chinese populations, and they're increasingly fearful to shop because I imagine stories from their relatives back home.
Yep, absolutely, and we're seeing that anecdotal evidence in some of the shopping centres in Australia as well, the major shopping centres. But we're seeing some estimates from the likes of Deloitte Access Economics about what this might mean, the coronavirus, what it might mean to the economy if it goes into the second part of this year, how that affects Chinese students, also the bushfire crisis. Now there's talk that the budget surplus is just not achievable. Are you a little bit less optimistic than you were last week?
Yeah, look, probably a little bit less optimistic, but I still think the budget will broadly be in balance. The first 6 months of this financial year have been very good for the government. The iron ore price, coal price, very high. This second 6 month period, of course, is going to be less good, but it may not outweigh the first 6 months still. I thought it was interesting on the bushfires. The Reserve Bank's come out and given an estimate of what it thinks it will do to the economy. I think it was 0.2 percentage points of GDP, kind of over a 6 month period. But they haven't said anything specific about the coronavirus. So that is the big unknown. We just don't know the damage that will have on the economy, and I think it will probably be much bigger than 0.2 percentage points of GDP because, as you suggest, it does seem to be getting worse every week. We're up to 900 deaths or so now, although I might add it's still only 2.2% of infected people die from corona. It's not very lethal. So of course it's worth worrying about, but it's probably the least lethal kind of epidemic that we've seen in the world for a number of years.
It's incredible to see the concerns around the coronavirus, the effects of the bushfire crisis, really the warnings about the shock to our economy, but see markets buck that trend, and also a very upbeat RBA last week, perhaps suggesting that there were not going to be 2 rate cuts this year, as has long been slated.
Yeah, look, it's a very good point there. The financial markets, if you like, I think have been increasingly divorced from the real economy for quite some time now. They're far more concerned about what the Federal Reserve is going to say and do than they are about the coronavirus. And the reality is money is still very, very cheap. And so stock markets around the world have been roaring to record highs on the back of cheap money. So that is a concern. And we're seeing the same effect locally. So yeah, the financial markets are not necessarily the place to look to get a good gauge on kind of what's happening in the real economy.
No, well, it's good to know. It's high stakes gambling
exactly.
in many ways.
Exactly.
Before I let you go, can I ask you about this debate in Parliament at the moment about coal? It's a real schism in the National Party at the moment, and indeed in the government. The government has long promised a feasibility study into a new heli plant, low emissions, high efficiency plant in Collinsville. What does a feasibility study actually mean? Because the market has really rejected this in many ways.
Well, it's certainly good for consultants, a feasibility study, because it probably means, $5 to $10 million for them. But look, it's probably a political delaying tactic. I mean, obviously, we already know how to build coal-fired power stations, and we are talking about sites where they've already been built. So I don't really see the economic point of a feasibility study. This is all about politics. It's all about delay. It's all about the government kind of testing the waters as to whether they can get enough political support to support a coal-fired power station. I mean, my view is they have to build some sort of extra baseload power, whether it's coal, whether it's gas. They can't just increasingly rely on wind and solar because it's too intermittent.
Yeah, look, the case has been made that Queensland actually has a surplus of power. That was made by Labor yesterday. But when it comes down to it, I mean, I'm asking for your view now. Isn't it where government should step in, where the market won't?
Yeah, look, I think that's the case. I think energy markets are not really an ordinary free market in the sense of the word. It's not like going out, for a restaurant meal. It's not. It's the supply side, the demand side are extraordinarily affected by government regulation, and that's always been the case. So I think this argument that we just need to let the market decide just doesn't make any sense at all. I noticed Richard Marles was saying that extensively on the weekend, but he doesn't seem to understand what a market is. The energy market is riven with regulation already, and so given that's the case, then there is a case for the government to step in and ensure that there is cheap power. It is a fundamental expectation of government that there be cheap power, and certainly there is not at the moment.
Thank you, Adam. Great to hear you. You're always a straight talker on First Edition. Good to see you. See you soon.
Thanks, Laura. Thanks.